Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it. Hey everyone, welcome to the Figure It Out cast for July 2019. I'm Adam Koralik, and today I am joined by a special guest. I am joined by the Sega Southern Gentleman, or Southern Sega Gentleman, I apologize. And do you want to introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, man, no worries about that. Believe me, you are not. I've been called the Saturn Sega Gentleman, the Sega Southern. I've been called all kinds of crap, but yeah, I'm the SSG. Name's Samuel Miles. I don't hide who I am. It's right there on my channel banner by all means. And I am a lover of Sega. I am not an arcade fanboy. I grew up in the 5th and 6th generation, so my appreciation is a little bit different. But yeah, I make YouTube videos, I do podcasts, and I generally like to play games.
You have an amazing voice. The first time we got on the phone here for a second, I was just like, dude, I think I'm on with Sam Elliott. It was impressive. So I want to thank you for being on here, Sam Elliott. That is awesome to me. No, in all seriousness, thank you. Seriously. This came about because another a Patreon backer of mine named Wubio, who's also a fan of yours, right? He decided that he wanted you to be on the show, and he just came to Patreon and was like, all right, I'm going to upgrade for this month and just have you on. So that's a really cool fan you have there.
Yeah, dude, he is absolutely amazing. I never want people to send me stuff, by no means. I don't put a PO box on my channel or anything like that. And he has emphatically a number of times been like, look, man, let me send you something. Let me you need this. And I don't understand why I have fans like that at this point. You know, I really don't even like using the term fan, to be honest with you. I mean, they're members of my community as far as I'm concerned. But he's a really cool dude, and there's a lot of people just like him in the community that really make the whole YouTube thing pretty awesome.
Yeah, it's so true. Having done this for 10 years now, you'd be amazed how many cool people come along the way where you're just like, people will bend over backwards to help you, even though you tell them, like, no, it's cool, you don't have to do that. So, Wubio, keep doing what you do. You're making the YouTube gaming world a better place. So thank you for that. Anything else you'd like to say in the intro, or would you like to get on with the subjects?
Let's see. Bernie Stoller. The Saturn was our future. That's all I got to say.
Okay. All right. Then we will start. The first subject, which almost all of these were selected by you, as is a perk of being able to be on the podcast. So the first one you wanted to talk about was Saturn experiences as kids, or basically like our story with the Saturn. Would you like to go first, or would you like me to go first?
Yeah, I'll go first. Excuse me. I brought this up because I remember a number of years ago watching one of your videos, and if I remember correctly, you didn't have any experiences with the Saturn at the time. It was pretty much Genesis and then Dreamcast, correct?
Correct. Like, I had a bit of a story with the 32X, but Saturn, to me, I hadn't even heard about it until after Dreamcast was, like, dead. We can go into that later, but it sounds like you actually had a story.
Yeah, and that's the deal with it. I was one of those few guys who actually had a Saturn. And the thing with it, the funny part about it is that, to kind of give an idea of my age and probably why I'm not so much an arcade gamer, I was born in 1990. So whenever the Saturn came out, I was 5 years old, and that's whenever I got my Genesis. And I played the Master System at my cousin's house. A week later, I got his Genesis, or her Genesis, excuse me. That was a brother sister, and I got the Genesis. And 2 years later, I finally got my Saturn. And I can remember, because we had a lot of commercials. We had commercials on TV. I remember seeing it all the time, you know. And there was a PlayStation and the Saturn. And even though the PlayStation looked awesome, I was a Sega guy, dude. I had this Sega Genesis, and there was a Sega Saturn, and it just kind of blew my mind. The 3D polygons and everything. I can remember seeing trailers, or not trailers, but commercials for Panzer Dragoon and stuff like that. And I just absolutely wanted to play that thing. And my little local video store, I come from a town that had like 2,000 people, and the video store had a whole bunch of Saturn games. There was, a whole bunch for that store. There's probably about 15 games to choose from, and I was just blown away by looking at the back of them, and you could actually open them up and look inside the manuals and everything. And finally, whenever I was, for my 7th birthday in '97, I got a Saturn. I got a used Saturn from that very same store. We paid $75. That was after tax and everything. It was just a flat rate, $75, and I got a Model 2 Sega Saturn. and it was a little beaten up, and I absolutely loved it. And the funniest part about it is that I walked right next door to the Walmart, which was a smaller Walmart back in the day. Walked up in there and made my mom buy me Resident Evil for my very first game on the Sega Saturn. It had come out not even a week before that, and I didn't even know it. We just walked up in the store, and I was looking for Saturn games. She said I could get one game. And all my buddies had been, who were about 2 or 3 years older than me, they were talking about Resident Evil on the school bus. And I saw Resident Evil, and I was like, I've got to get this game. So I got it and got back to the house, and this was a Friday night. And literally Friday night, all of Saturday and Saturday night, I got scared shitless as a little 7-year-old kid playing Resident Evil on the Sega Saturn. And that was the beginning of my journey. And I absolutely love that console, dude. It is tied for my favorite best console with the PS2. And it's just, there's so many memories with it, and it blows my mind still to this day. I mean, I knew that the Sega Saturn wasn't the biggest thing. I mean, most of my friends had PlayStations, but there was always this uniqueness to the Sega Saturn and how it did things, the way it looked, the way the games played, and I'd go over to my friend's house and bring my Saturn, and he'd play the Saturn, I'd play his PS2, and I make a joke about it. He had an original, very first run PS1, excuse me. I'd have to flip it upside down to play games, and I would laugh at him, be like, "Look, man, my Sega Saturn going strong, and I'm sitting over here, got your PS1 turned over," and I didn't understand as a 7-year-old kid why the Sega Saturn was as small as it was. Whenever everybody and their mom had a Sega Genesis, I mean, we called it the Sega. That was the Sega, and I think that appreciation for it has just grown over the years. And the biggest thing about it is that's just still bewilders me is how little people actually know about the Sega Saturn. It's this invisible thing, this thing that people talk about in whispers and shit. And finally, it seems like it's getting the love and deserve it. I mean, the love it actually deserves at this point. So,
yeah, I would agree with that. Like, I made a video once doing all about the Saturn and my story with it, and I've always found the Saturn to be fascinating because there's a lot of obscure consoles throughout history that people don't know much about. The Sega Saturn is the weird dark horse console where it was one of the mainstream ones. Like, it should have been super popular. It was right there, yet still almost nobody knows anything about it. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you said that it's finally starting to get its due. People are starting to finally take notice of it. It's, at least from a collector standpoint, the games are finally starting to become very sought after and everything. And as we'll get into a little bit later, there is a bit of a resurgence with that thing, but we'll save that for later. But that was a cool story. Thank you for sharing that. Because he's right, guys. It's pretty rare to find anyone who has like some big, childhood memory of the Saturn where that's like their console and they ended up loving it. Because the handful of times that I've talked to anybody who did have a Saturn as a kid, it was always like, that was a mistake, I should have got a PlayStation. It's very rare that anyone was like, no, I'm glad I got that instead of a PlayStation. And I mean that in a positive way, because I love the Saturn too, but usually that's not how it goes. So it's cool to hear that.
Yeah, there was a bunch of people. I want to touch on that for 1 second. There's a bunch of people that I've met that, even though they still love the Saturn today, they are, they wish they had got a PS1 because, they were maybe in my same situation. They were lower income, didn't have a lot of money. And to be able to experience the PS1 games, because I had the ability to play those PS1 games in tandem with my Sega Saturn. I had a number of friends I could go over to their house and play their games all the time. So things like Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII, the Chrono Trigger games, Driver, all these games, I had the chance to experience them in tandem with my Saturn experience. So I never really had a hate or anything towards Sony like I see from a number of other Saturn owners from back in that time. There seems to always be this rivalry back in the day. But for me, it's just an appreciation, dude. I loved gaming, period. That's why I really don't consider myself a fanboy. I love the Saturn. I love the games that were on it. The exclusives like Panzer Dragoon, my favorite game of all time being Gun Griffin. And most people that listen to this podcast, I promise you, they don't know what that game is. But it's the best damn mech game on the console. Go play it. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of cool to see all the differing viewpoints and the differing opinions on the Saturn, especially from people who actually owned it back in the day.
Yeah, unfortunately, I was not one of those. Like, I'll give you the Cliff Notes version of my story because, like I said, I did tell this in a video. But basically, I had never heard of the Saturn until after the Dreamcast. Like, to me, Sega was the Genesis. You know, I didn't really know anything about the Sega CD at the time. I did have a friend who had a 32X, so I knew about that. But I just kind of assumed the 32X was like their next platform, I guess, as far as what, you know, a child's mind would think of that situation. And then it's like Sega went away, they were just gone, and then when the Dreamcast came, that was like, oh, Sega's back. It wasn't until afterwards I had found out they even had another console in between, and by then it was, I didn't know anyone ever who had one, and all I could ever find on it was like negative press. Like, I remember seeing a lot of ads for PlayStation where I remember this one ad in particular of this kid who has a lemonade stand, and he's trying to earn money to get a PlayStation, and all he has instead of lemonade is he has like a stack of Saturns he's trying to sell for 25 cents a piece just to get a PS1. And I was like, that's cold, Sony. But yeah, like that was all I really knew about the Saturn until I eventually got one in high school at some point. I just bought one from somebody online. I bought like a big lot, and it came with a bunch of stuff, and but by that point it was mostly games that were either on the PS1, but they were slightly not as good versions. I mean, I didn't really have early access to any of the big hitters like your Burning Rangers or your Panzer Dragoons. I think the most exclusive thing I had at the time was Bug. So I didn't, yeah, exactly. I didn't really have much to go on. And then I ended up collecting more for it later, and respecting it more later. But by the time I'd actually tried one, it was sometime in high school. And the only side story I have to that is by the time I had one, I knew to hunt down a couple of games like Nights into Dreams, and I had this one friend in particular who was the only person who appreciated that I had found a Saturn, because he had been wanting to play, apparently he'd been wanting to play Nights for the better part of a decade, but he didn't know anyone with Saturn, he never found one, anything. So I remember one time he came over, once we had that game, he's like, we're going to do this, we got out the sodas, and we're like, we're just going to spend a whole night, and we're just going to play Nights into Dreams all the way through. And that was cool. That was like, but that was unfortunately like the closest thing I have to like some great childhood memory of the Saturn.
Damn it, boy. That is kind of a very small experience with it, man.
It is as a kid anyway. But yeah, so do you have anything else to say on this subject, or would you like to move forward?
Well, I think the one thing I do want to say about it is that if your only experience with the Sega Saturn has been, I mean, we're going to talk about it a little bit later, but if your only experience with the Sega Saturn has been watching videos on YouTube or reading articles, stuff like that, the emulation of the Sega Saturn is a lot easier now. I'm not going to say it's perfect, but it's a hell of a lot better than it was. So take a chance at it, man. Just go experience some of the games for yourself and see what you think about it. Because in my opinion, the Sega Saturn is a console that is a lot better to play than to watch, if that makes any sense.
Of course.
Because if you're only going off of the visual aspect of it, watching somebody else play a game, it completely takes something away from it. Because it's so integral to have that controller in your hand and actually kind of feel what the console can do, because I think that's where a lot of people fall in love with it, because it is an amazing console whenever done properly with the correct people behind it, people actually knowing how to utilize the system and not just some third-rate port from the PlayStation.
I agree with that, but I want to make sure you understand, like, that's just the experience I had as a kid. As an adult, I've acquired many more games and things have changed. So we'll get back to that later.
That's another thing too, though. I think we'll touch on it later, but just for full disclosure, I by no means consider myself a collector.
Mm-hmm. That's it.
Yeah, I'm not a collector, man. I've got a whole video about it's not collecting. It's not about collecting, bro. For me, it's all about them memories.
And that's totally fair. Whatever makes you happy when it comes to gaming, do it. And that's really all I have to say on that.
Thanks, man. Full support on that, man. I think people just need to let people be themselves and enjoy what they want to do.
Exactly. Like, gaming isn't just about playing the games. It can be any number of things. I mean, it can be studying it, it can be collecting it, it's understanding the history, having the memories, whatever it is. As long as it's about video games and it makes you happy, doesn't hurt anybody, we're all part of that same community.
Just watching in about 100 years in universities, we're going to have a class called Retro Gaming 101 or something, and they're going to be talking about the PS12.
Oh, yeah. Are you ready to move on to the next subject?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
All right. So this next subject was actually one I picked, but it was just because I feel like this was almost required. So this won't be too long. But basically, Nintendo announced the Nintendo Switch Lite. And this happened while I was in the air. I was flying home, and I landed, and everybody's like, oh, talk about this. I'm like, what the hell is this? So basically, here's the breakdown. Nintendo Switch Lite is an updated version of the Switch that is $100 less. And it essentially has no new features. The only things that are better about it is it does have better battery life, and it's smaller. However, it does not have removable Joy-Cons. It cannot function in tabletop mode. It does not connect to a TV. It's not compatible with the Switch dock. And that's about it. It's just more of a budget version for people who want to use the console, I should say the handheld, the platform, exclusively in handheld mode. What do you think of that?
Another full disclosure, I am not the biggest Nintendo fan. I know I just said I'm not a fanboy, but I've never been into a lot of their games. My little brother had an N64, and with the exception of things like Blast Corps and Star Fox, I really wasn't big into it. But last year I got my wife a Nintendo Switch. She grew up with Nintendo. She had the Nintendo 64, Super Nintendo, GameCube, all stuff like that. And, I've played a couple of games on it, like Breath of the Wild and, of course, Mario Kart. My wife loves playing that game. But for me, I think there's just a disconnect there, because we were talking about it a little bit earlier. For me, a handheld console needs to be a certain size. I need to be able to just drop it into my pocket. I need to be able to take it on the go. That's why I love the PSP so much. I mean, there's so many great games on it, and it's right there in my hands. It's small, it's compact. I could take it wherever and play it anytime I want to. And I would assume the same thing would be the case with like the Nintendo 3DS and 2DS, etc. But whenever it comes to the Switch, for me, the Switch is honestly a home console. I know it's billed as this, home console in tandem with a portable console. And I've seen where in Japan it's absolutely huge and people love it. And of course, there's people on YouTube here in the States who are just all about it. But for me, that console is a home console. It needs to be stuck in dock mode. I'm just not really there yet with this idea of being able to take something from the house and take it on the road with me. And again, it's about size, man. I mean, I know we're all used to these giant smart screens we got that don't even have a 16:9 aspect ratio anymore. But I mean, dude, I'd have to be wearing trip pants from the 90s to put that thing in my pocket, even the light version. I mean, seriously, I still got some trip pants, but I really don't feel like wearing them out in public. I mean, I'm just not that kind of guy anymore. I mean, I'll do it if I have to, but it's just, I don't quite understand the appeal of it. I think, of course, there's a market for it. People will buy it. There's going to be people on YouTube talking about it and blowing it out of proportion and everything like that. And I mean, it's just how gaming is today. But I still consider myself very much a console gamer. And for me, a console gamer means I have to be at my house in front of a TV. There's that whole experience of sitting in front of your TV on your couch, on the floor, whatever the case is, and experiencing the games with another person. I think, multiplayer gaming, especially nowadays, has turned into an online-only thing. We don't really have co-op or local multiplayer anymore. But that was one thing I kind of like about the Nintendo Switch as it currently is, because me and my wife can sit there. She have one half of the Joy-Con, I have the other Joy-Con, and we can play these games like, I don't remember what the name of it is, but there's like this cooking game where you have to run around and get all the parts and put it all together. She loves it and I love it, and we get frustrated and scream at each other and holler, and then it's all good. It brings back those memories of being a kid sitting on the couch with all your friends and just having a great time. And I think you lose that component by being stuck in your own individual little bubble with this console, that the only way you can play with other people is via Wi-Fi.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see what you're saying. I have to admit that the Nintendo Switch Lite is definitely not for me. I can tell this thing's going to be successful. There's no dispute there. It also is basically the death nail in the coffin of the 3DS. I mean, they're just admitting now straight up, like, this is our new handheld, which is just the old handheld, the Switch. I can see this being successful, although to me personally it won't be of much use, because he and I are in when I say this, I'm talking about the audience. He and I are both in the same group, the minority of people who actually use their Switch docked. It's something like 70% of people who have a Switch use it portably almost exclusively. There's very few people, percentage-wise, that use it in docked mode. We happen to be in that group. So an all-portable version of the Switch does not really appeal to me. But then again, this wasn't made for me, and I can tell already that this thing is going to be successful. So yeah, if you were waiting on the Switch because you just wanted it for portable mode, this is probably going to be for you. Or if you wanted a different version that's just got better battery life, I guess that's also for you, and you were looking to quote-unquote upgrade. But aside from that, I don't really see that much point in this. But one thing I've learned from Nintendo is they can make these minor changes that usually are detrimental to the product. They have less features, whatever, and somehow they still end up being super successful. So it's with anybody else, this would be a huge criticism, but with them, it's like, oh, they're going to make like $100 billion out of this. So good for them.
That's
but
true.
yeah,
That's true.
Do you have anything else to say on this, or do you want to move on?
It's Nintendo being Nintendo, man. That's all I got.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't matter if it has less content, less features, and is less valuable. It will do infinitely well. So good for Nintendo.
I don't know how your audience is, but at this point, Nintendo's kind of become a meme. It's just like, make it a little bit bigger or make it a little bit smaller, put a bigger screen on it, give it an extra button. That's kind of what Nintendo has done since the Wii U. I mean, that's basically what's happened. Mm-hmm. And it kind of sucks from an innovation standpoint, even though they're incredibly innovative in how they do things. But honestly, I see that as their detriment at this point. I mean, the Switch has been a resounding success, and I'm very glad for it because competition breeds a number of new accesses for us as consumers, not only games and everything else, but I kind of feel like Nintendo's getting stuck in this point where they might as well not even be console manufacturers anymore. I mean, that's kind of where it feels at my point.
That's essentially how it is. I mean, essentially the Nintendo Switch is a portable platform that happens to support TV mode, so you and I can get something out of it. But let's keep it real. This is further proof that they don't really care about the home console market. And I've talked about that in videos and stuff in the past. And if we go down that rabbit hole, we'll just be talking about this forever. So, right. Let's deviate because we had some more important subjects anyway. But either way, Nintendo Switch Lite is coming. Like it or not, it's going to be a thing. So the next subject you wanted to talk about was the Dreamcast's flaws and what could have been better about it. So I'm going to let you lead the way on that.
All right, so the Dreamcast is my second favorite console. I have a lot of history with the console, not only from the actual consoles part of it, but I actually made an entire video talking about a dream can save a life. And for me, the Dreamcast was honestly this console that got me through a lot of rough times. In fact, one of my roughest times in my life, it was the only console I had. My mom had basically kept it for me and my old TV, and she gave it to me before I moved about 400 miles away from where I was living at the time, and that got me through a lot of hellacious parts of my life. But even though I love the console and appreciate it so much, and in a lot of ways, kind of owe it to some degree, there's still a lot of flaws with the system, and there was flaws I was even aware of back whenever it was still a relevant console. For one, lack of 2 analog sticks. I mean, there's a very, very big schism in the community between people who actually enjoy the controller and people who absolutely loathe it. And I'm kind of one of those people who kind of really loathe the controller. Lack of 2 analog sticks really limited what kind of games we could actually have sometimes, especially with the emergence of first-person shooters in their modern format. On top of the fact that you kind of just had this there was so many arcade games, and what I mean by that is arcade style games, and you still see it with the popular games today like Power Stone, Marvel vs. Capcom, these arcade exclusives that were brought to home consoles. But there wasn't really a lot of, I think you've talked about it before, but a lack of RPGs. I mean, besides Shenmue, which is kind of a quasi-RPG in a sense, and then you've got things like Skies of Arcadia, Grandia 2. I mean, there wasn't really a lot of variety in the types of games in some respects, but then you look at it and it was just all over the place. I mean, you had things like Crazy Taxi, Jet Set Radio. I mean, it was a weird console, and I personally feel that, in my opinion, it could have been accessed a lot better by much more people if there had been a larger variety of games, as well as a different style of controller. You know, a controller that would have lasted for the sixth generation. I still feel like, you know, there was some respects the Dreamcast isn't really a sixth gen console. It's kind of like a 5.5 gen, if that makes any sense. It's kind of like stuck in the fifth generation with that mentality, but it just was unfortunate enough to just be a little too soon for the sixth generation, if you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, so basically it is the first sixth gen console, but it was designed to be competition for the fifth gens. Essentially, that's what happened with the Dreamcast. The problem is, and if I understand the premise of this subject correctly, it's just things we would have wanted to do differently. Controllers, one of them. I bet DVD support would be another. The problem with the Dreamcast, as you point out there, is that it was essentially designed to fight older hardware, which was a mistake, because I just did a check here. So the DualShock controller, which was the introduction of basically two joysticks when Sony did that, they didn't do that until late 1997. By that point, the Dreamcast was like well into design phase, and I'm guessing someone at Sega just said like either they didn't really have much faith in that concept of two joysticks, or it was too late to change it. Because what people tend to forget is that the Dreamcast actually launched a year earlier in Japan. It came out in November of '98. So
Yep.
it wasn't realistic to add joysticks and add a DVD player. It was that none of that stuff was ever going to happen. They also had to keep costs down because they were launching the Dreamcast at a loss. I mean, most people, if it weren't for, I forget his name now, but if it weren't for this one investor they had, this like Japanese dude who was like a multi-billionaire, if it weren't for him, there's no way they could have launched Dreamcast. They would have been done with the Saturn. So financially speaking, they had to keep it fiscally responsible. But if I could make some changes in a fantasy world, the controller, that one was probably plausible. That was probably someone just betting that the DualShock thing wasn't going to work out, which was the wrong decision. DVD was, as much as people would love to believe it, was never plausible. That was never going to happen. The console was had started development like 3 years before DVD was standard. So to think that it was going to have that it was basically unrealistic. The other one that they could have done, and this was something they unfortunately learned the wrong lesson on the Saturn from, was the lasers. The Saturn spent a lot of time, they spent a lot of effort building Sega Saturn lasers really well, which is partially why when you were talking about before about how it always worked and your PS1 didn't work, or you had to flip it over or whatever, the Saturn was pretty reliable in that sense, but it was too costly, so they shut that, or they cut it down a bit for the Dreamcast, which is unfortunately its biggest hindrance, is that it's the GD-ROM unit tends to die relatively easily. That's something I really wish they had fixed. That all of that combined, you would have had a flawless system basically. And then of course, if you want to say let's go fantasy world, let's throw backwards compatibility in with Saturn, which at one point was supposed to be a thing, that would have been great. But yeah, I mean, what else were you thinking you would have liked to change? Because I think for the most part, Sega did like, I want to say like 98% of everything right with the Dreamcast. It's just they just didn't have enough money to keep going. That was their flaw.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that. There isn't a whole bunch of things that could have been changed. It's just kind of like you were talking about. It's a fantasy world thing. Controller, the access to games. Could it have had DVD support again, like you said? I mean, wasn't Sony the copyright holder of DVD at the time?
They still are. DVD falls under, video formats fall under a weird situation where there's a parent company. In the case of DVD and Blu-ray, it's like Sony owns part of it, Philips owns part of it. There's like this weird grouping, but it's a standard license agreement. So that's why you can have DVD and Blu-ray support in Xbox One, even though it's Sony owned and controlled. It's because Microsoft, pays for that license. The same thing could have applied here, but I don't think, and we know now that Sega didn't really have any interest in that. They wanted to make a video game console. I mean, it wasn't until the PS2 came about that anybody thought putting movie systems into video game consoles was a good idea or necessary, really. I mean, you had VCD support on certain platforms, but that was never like a selling point of it. So right. To Sony's credit, they did change that for the industry. That's why you were right to an extent. The Dreamcast just kind of fell. It was like a 6th-gen console that was fighting an old war.
Yeah, I think the only thing I could really push, and people have been going back and forth about what could have saved the Dreamcast forever. I mean, by there's no way the Dreamcast could have succeeded the way that a lot of us wish it could have. It's just the cards were well too stacked against it. But I think the best thing that could have happened for it was, and this is the craziest thing that I think sometimes, is just what we have today with, I mean, we take it for granted at this point now because it's just kind of commonplace, but these mid-generation upgrades, I mean, it would have been the equivalent of an add-on back then, but I think that could have possibly been to the benefit of the Dreamcast, even just for longevity of gaming-wise, is if we had seen something in 2001, 2002, where we would have gotten an upgraded form of a Dreamcast that did support DVD or did support, you know, some other peripheral of some kind that allowed for the games to be larger or something along that lines. That's way off fantasy, but
no, it's not. We got it. It was called the Xbox.
Right, that is something that I have literally screamed and hollered at people about. It's like everybody's like, when we're getting a Dreamcast 2. The Xbox was a Dreamcast 2. Just look at the controller.
Yep. The original Xbox is your sequel to a Dreamcast. I mean, almost literally. At one point, there was
there was talks between Sega and Microsoft.
Yeah, they were going to have backwards compatibility with the Dreamcast and that thing, but the deal fell through because Microsoft looked at the Sega's proposal as like eating a tumor. Like they didn't want to deal with Sega's problems. Although I think I don't know. I still am glad that deal never happened, to be honest, because I kind of like that Sega has anonymity or autonomy. Sorry, it has autonomy. It doesn't have to deal with Microsoft. But at the same time, it would have been interesting to see how that would have played out, because part of that deal would have been Sega would have been responsible for Xbox distribution in Japan, so it might not have been dead on arrival like it always is.
Right.
The thing was, the Dreamcast would have survived through the 6th gen because there wouldn't have been an original Xbox. There would have been what we now know as the Xbox 360 would have been the first thing with Microsoft's name on it. That was part of that deal too. It would have been interesting to see how that version of history played out. But again, that's one of a million what ifs, including, you know, what if GTA 3 had hit Dreamcast like it was supposed to? What if Halo, which at one time was supposed to be a Dreamcast exclusive, granted it was a totally different game, I think it was an RTS, had hit Dreamcast instead of Xbox? Like, what if? Just, it's all what ifs. But the problem with that whole premise is, look at how many what ifs it takes for there to be a version of history where the Dreamcast ends up being successful. As much as I love that console, it just, as you said it, the cards were stacked against it. It was not going to happen.
Yeah, it was it came at a wrong time. It was a great system, had a lot of very unique games to it, a lot of experiences that you couldn't find elsewhere, and still to this day seemingly can't find. But it was just, it just wasn't meant to be. It really wasn't. And I think the only what if that really is worth anything is the idea of Sega effectively being bought out by Microsoft. That's the only one I've ever bought into, because I think that Sega would have lasted better and continued down the path they were going with their uniqueness per se if they had been bought out by Microsoft. I feel like with the failure of the Dreamcast, it took us a long time for Sega to get back to being Sega. And I think that's just now in the last couple of years they've really started doing that again.
That is correct. But at the same time, I worry about that version of history, because look what they've done with almost everybody they've absorbed. And when I say that, I refer to Microsoft. Like, look what happened to Rare. There was a time where Rare was like the game developer. It was like they were like, anything with their name on it was an amazing success. And ever since they've been under Xbox, they've really done almost nothing. And they've been owned by them for like the better part of almost 20 years now. And they don't get anything really accomplished. That's just an example. But I mean, I'm just saying that, I don't know. It seems like whenever anybody gets absorbed by Microsoft under the Xbox division, they somehow end up getting folded into a system they can't do anything in, an ecosystem they can't operate in. I don't know what that is, what that issue is over there, or if I don't know. But that's why I just don't think that partnership would have been the match made in heaven that we all think of, especially when Sega, being a very prideful Japanese company, having to constantly do what their American overlords tell them to do. I don't think that would have worked out too nicely.
Dude, it would have been a very good version of a reverse history. Instead of, Sega Japan basically demanding of Sega of America, we would have had Microsoft of America demanding of Microsoft Japan.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know. It would have been. I would love to, do a portal jump and see what that version of history looks like, but I don't think I'd want to live in it. But who knows? anything else you want to say on this?
I'm good to go, brother.
All right, then I will. All right, so next up we have a round of shout-outs. So I didn't even mention it. This is a Patreon-backed podcast, so thank you guys. But if you are not on the Patreon, you can join at any time if you wish. You get all sorts of potential perks and rewards, such as shout-outs, which we're going to do in a second. You get early access to videos, or you can even be on this podcast, as Samuel here knows. So let's just do our round of shout-outs here. So every single person here donated and is at that level. We got Corey Marsh, Jesse Perez, Joseph Tamburino, Luis Bonilla, Michael Kelly, Eric Perales, Trey Wagner, and Tim Inman. Once again, that's Corey Marsh, Jesse Perez, Joseph Tamburino, Luis Bonilla, Michael Kelly, Eric Perales, Trey Wagner, and Tim Inman. Thank you all. Again, you can upgrade at any time or join at any time if you want. But next up, again, another perk here. You get to pick all the subjects. So this next subject you picked was thoughts on the Dreamcast and Saturn resurgence. This is where we were going to kind of talk about what has happened as of late. So would you like to kick this off?
Oh, most certainly, most certainly. This has been something I have absolutely loved. You have spoken of the Dreamcast Junkyard many times.
Yes.
And I never knew what that was back in the day whenever I was watching your videos until about 2016, whenever I finally joined the Dreamcast Junkyard Facebook group. Now, that led to, in late 2017, there was a sister group to the Dreamcast Junkyard known as the Saturn Junkyard, started by Mr. Simon Early, who is also known by Father K, one of my very close friends at this point. And he was starting this group that was all about the Saturn, and when I saw it, I jumped on it like white on rice. Because the Saturn is my baby. I absolutely love the Dreamcast, but like I've said, the Saturn is my baby, man. And that was the first real instance I had seen of the Saturn getting the love that I felt like it deserved. And this was about the same time that you saw a lot of channels on YouTube that were actively talking about Saturn games. It seemed like around 2015 there was this kind of easy resurgence into talking about the Saturn. I think it had gotten to a point, at that point it was 20 years old in 2015. So there was a lot of people who were actually starting to talk about this thing again. And like we talked about earlier, there's a lot of people who don't know about it. So it's got this air of nostalgia as well as this kind of intrigue about what is this thing? What happened to it? Why did it fail? Why don't I remember it? Stuff like that. And it's been so awesome to be a part of this community that's grown around it on Facebook, on YouTube, because even to this day, there's still not a lot of people who are dedicated to the Saturn. My channel, for the most part, talks a lot about Saturn games, but I'm not dedicated to it. But that just kind of shows the community and the love that we have for it. Is just, we constantly talk about it. I've got a friend, I asked you before if I can mention a couple of people, but one of my good buddies, David Lee, he does absolutely amazing reproductions. I know that's a very on or off topic, but he makes complete reproductions of games that were never meant for America, that he makes them Americanized. Long boxes, full color manuals, disc art, everything else. There's people like that, and there's a number of people in the community that do that. There's people who are now getting on the translation scene like nobody can believe it. I remember whenever people were talking about Police Knots, and now we have Link Liver's Story. We have a Grandia translation in the works. We have
I have the long box. I have the long box of Link Liver's Story, like the fan-made one.
You have the one from David. That's right.
It was sold, at least that version was sold exclusively at a convention called Cowlitz Cowlitz Gamers for Kids in Cowlitz, Washington. It's a thing run by John Hancock. There's only like 10, at least for that version, made, and I got one of them. So I'm 100% with you. I love that resurgence. But anyway, I just wanted to say I had that one. Keep going.
Yeah, the story behind that kind of is, and the thing that's cool is that the resurgence of this Saturn appreciation is, I jumped on it so early that people like Father K brought me into the junkyard. We started a podcast. I actually started to get involved with all these people, and now I know all these people. Like what you're talking about right there, that's Sega Saturn Shiro. Yep. It's our sister podcast, the Saturn Junkyard, and there's a member over there by the name of K. He also does reproductions of Murder of Crows, and he has been working with Cowlitz Gamers for Kids and John Hancock for a long time. He does the kind of multiplayer thing, and basically that was a way for them to let people know about the game, let people know about Sega Saturn Shiro, and to give back in the community. And that's the biggest thing about this Saturn community I've seen, is that there is so much giving back. It's like the main people in this community I know are constantly shouting out other members, smaller people, smaller creators. We're constantly involved in, these little, I guess you could call them community challenges of sorts. There's so much integration, and it's not really full of a lot of negativity like I see in other communities. It's a very humble group almost, and it's just awesome to be a part of that community. And I mean, we've talked about it before. I mean, you've talked about it for a long time with the Dreamcast having, brand new games created for it. But we actually have games that are being developed for the Sega Saturn. People like me who have no coding skills are learning how to code so I can translate games I love. Mm-hmm. And it's absolutely amazing to see this failure of a console that has such a loving following, and all these people finally coming together 20 years later. It's like one of my very best friends now is that guy, David Lee, all the way in California. I've never met him, but I've talked to him a number of times. I've talked to him on the phone. We talked about life. I've really created a number of awesome friendships because of this console that I was one of like 7 people in my town to have.
Yeah, no, I find it kind of fascinating that the Saturn has had that sudden resurgence. And so people might be asking, like, well, why did the Dreamcast have it for so long and the Saturn didn't? Aside from the fact that the Dreamcast was more well-known, the Dreamcast had an unfair advantage, which was the mill CD exploit, the thing that basically allowed it to play burned games, is also the thing that allowed it to have a community, because people could make new content for it and use that exploit to produce new content. Saturn was pretty heavily piracy locked. Like, you could, bypass it with mod chips and things, but it didn't have the ability to write new software. It's only as of late that people are starting to find ways around it, and that the respect for it has increased, and it's no longer seen as much as that dark horse console as we talked about before. I think what's really cool about the Saturn, though, is that it has a huge advantage the Dreamcast never did, which is the Dreamcast, had 248 games released in the States. Saturn had 244. But in Japan, the Dreamcast only had like an additional like 400 games or something like that. Maybe it was like 500. And most of them are like date sims, things you can't really do much with. But the Saturn, on the other hand, had a ton of incredible content that was only released in Japan because Bernie Stolar didn't have interest in it for one reason or another. And so with simple translation, patches and so forth, you now essentially can start pumping out quote unquote new games for the Saturn, which is what you were just talking about. And as the fan base gets more increasingly excited to do North American style cases and all that stuff, you can really get a whole lot of new games, essentially new games for the Sega Saturn, which is a second rebirth. Would you agree with that basic premise?
Oh, 100%. I mean, like I said, I'm a guy who had no interest in coding, and at this point I have created North American artwork and manuals for Gun Griffin 2 and Bulk Slash, which never came out in the States. They're both mech games, and there's a really cult following behind them, but they were never here. I'm learning how to code, and I'm just one example. I am not that big an exception to the Saturn community. It seems like the Saturn community is so... It's not really kind of, to the periphery. I've kind of noticed that with the Dreamcast, especially nowadays. It seems like there's a lot of people who kind of, quote unquote, following coattails of sorts. There isn't as much actual, interacting with the actual console itself. It's kind of just like a bystander kind of thing. Whereas the Saturn, it really seems like almost everybody who's involved with the community at this point is really involved with the community in one respect or another. So it's a lot more hands-on. And since it's smaller, it's easier to get a hold of people. It's easier to get a hold of people who are doing the translations and sorts. And one of the biggest things that has really brought about this resurgence, and you were kind of talking about it with the whole aspect of piracy, or how to get around all of these security lockouts that the Saturn has. The Saturn has a wobble in its actual disc on that prevents games from being played unless you have a security bypass. And for the longest time, including myself, it was a mod chip. And in that respect, if you have a mod chip, you can play anything you absolutely want to in conjunction with a BIOS mod, or as simple as an action replay card. That cartridge slot is what has made the Saturn so easily available to people at this point because of things like Pseudo Saturn. Pseudo Saturn is a cartridge. You can buy it or you can, flash mod and an action replay card, slap it up in there, and you can play almost the entirety of the library right then and there. And piracy is, you think about it what you want to, but at the end of the day, the biggest barrier to Saturn appreciation for a long time was the cost of games. I mean, even absolute crap games still go for $20, $50. And if you want an actual good game, it's going to cost you anywhere from $50 to $100, generally speaking. And that's more than a retail brand new game. Yep. Most people aren't going to pay that. So now you have effectively a blockbuster at your own house where you can, burn a game like hotcakes, see it. If you like it and you really want it, you can go buy it. Or if you just don't want to buy it, you can keep playing it. And it's by very nature of that issue of piracy and legality and everything else, I think that's probably the biggest component to the Saturn really being appreciated nowadays, is that the access to the games is so much easier now. Because for the longest time, emulation with the Saturn was an absolute ordeal. Compatibility issues, games not wanting to run right, Panzer Dragoon Saga chugging at like 5 frames a second. And nowadays, I mean, if you want to play Panzer Dragoon Saga, well, you can go pay $800 on eBay, or you can just go burn 4 discs. Memorex is real cheap, I'm just saying.
So that's another interesting point about the Saturn, and why I think it's suddenly gotten some attention, is that it's also a very unique case, because we talked about it before about how it was like a major console, it just didn't do well. But the other thing is the games for it, like nobody really had access to them. Emulation is what I'm hitting on here. Really hasn't been that great for it. I realize it is getting there, but the fact that it's been, the console's been out since '94. And we're still talking about it like, well, emulation's still getting there, is kind of impressive, that it's still not there yet. But also, it has so many games that are exclusive to that platform because they weren't big enough to ever port to anything. They were built on such unique hardware that moving them to anything else would be a pain in the ass. And in a lot of cases, the source code for them simply doesn't exist. So you have this strange dark horse console with a ton of exclusive content that you can really only play on this one little box. The fact that people are finally realizing that, largely probably due to the YouTube community, which we'll talk about later, does kind of breathe new life and new interest into the platform, which I think is fascinating.
Oh yeah, most certainly. And then you also have things like the Polymega, which are just now coming out, and I'm still on the fence about that. We're going to see what it is whenever it finally releases, and people can actually, because there's been a couple of YouTubers and other members of the community who have actually gotten to see it, and I've heard good things back. But I'm one of these guys. I'm a Southern guy, man. Seeing is believing, and until I actually see this thing running, and I know the person who's actually looking at it, or I'm personally looking at it, I'm going to hold judgment on that regard, because it is basically an emulation box at this point.
It is. I saw it in person at E3 this year, though I didn't really get to do anything with it. There was just too much going on, but it was there. It was real.
And you also have the FPGA scene, which has become amazing with older consoles, pre-5th generation consoles. But I think we're a ways away from it, because like you said, the Saturn has a very unique architecture. I mean, that those 2 chips, the whole method of how the Saturn creates 3D, and this is a topic unto itself, but the Saturn is a 3D machine. It's a 3D machine that does 2D absolutely amazing by nature of how it's programmed to do 3D. That's what it is. It's not a 2D powerhouse. It's a 3D console that, by how it's created and how it does 3D, just blows 2D out of the water. I mean, the combination of VDP1 and VDP2, just, it's amazing. But that also is the Achilles heel on combination with how it does polygons. So like you were talking about, the Saturn is a beast unto itself, and I'm looking forward to the day where we have an FPGA console of the Saturn that does it absolutely amazingly, and it's ease of access, and people could just load games onto an SD card, or drop an original game, or a burn game, or whatever the case is, because I think we're really going to see a renaissance. I've talked about a renaissance in the Saturn community for a long time, but I feel like even maybe the Polymega, but whenever you have mass market appeal, because the Saturn still to this day, generally speaking, is going to run you, anywhere between $80 to $100 for a console. Down here, I'm kind of lucky. I got a boxed Sega Saturn, I think it was around December. Boxed Sega Saturn, $50. Certain areas of the world, in certain areas of the United States, the Saturn is actually cheaper than the Dreamcast. I've
In
noticed
Japan, they're worthless, by the way.
There you go.
Because they were super successful there, so you can find them in junk stores constantly. Just saying.
And here in America, I mean, you don't even have to worry about a step down converter. 100 volts to 120 volts is nothing.
Yeah, exactly. It'll work right out of the. It'll have region coding, but as we're kind of getting into, that's mostly been bypassed.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many ways to access the console now, but I've lost two Saturns in the past 2 years. I have two Saturns currently that one of them I had to repair because of an issue with a peripheral. So that's what I'm getting at. These consoles are getting very old. They're CD-based consoles. There are ODE replacements like, the Rhea and Phoebe, and we also have the Sadiator that's in the process of hopefully coming out this year.
That's the one that goes through the VCD slot, right?
Yes, it's effectively a portable. It's an EverDrive. I know people get irritated with me saying it's an EverDrive, but it's an EverDrive. But I really feel like the true renaissance of the Saturn will happen whenever we have a FPGA console, or maybe even the Polymega, where you have a broad appeal to people, and people can buy a brand new console that will last them another 20 years. Because I honestly see the Sega Saturns that we have currently, if they last another 20 years, I'm going to be absolutely amazed. I am babying mine right now, and like I said, I've already lost two in the past 2 years.
I will say I agree with you that the Renaissance is coming, and I think one of the next big stepping stones, you're probably familiar with this already, but for those who aren't, is a guy I always talk about. Is a production company called Josh Prod, and he's been making new Dreamcast games for the last few years, but he's doing a Sega Saturn game. We're going to get a new Sega Saturn game, the first commercial indie Sega Saturn game. It's a fighting game. I don't know if the name has been announced yet.
Can I cut into this?
Of course, go for it.
Okay. As much as I love what you're talking about, as much as I love the possibility of a new Sega Saturn game, I talked about this in one of my videos, and I have had a number of people who have been integrated into the testing of this game who have spoken to me behind closed doors. And I have personally played a recent build of that game.
Oh, wow. Okay.
You have to have a 16 megabyte card, a 16 megabyte expansion to play that game. At current, there is really no way to have a 16 megabyte expansion on real hardware. Josh Prod will have to create a cartridge for the game.
Okay? It is coming with one.
Right, but what I'm getting at is he's going to have to create that.
Oh, he's going to create a bigger, better one.
Yeah, he's going to have to create a card that's going to go with the game. That's added cost onto it. But the biggest deal about it is this. I'm hoping that it's just early in development, but the way he's talked for the past year, I mean, this has basically been a year almost of talking about this. The game is... You play this thing on emulation with 16 with 16 megs of expansion, and I'm gonna be honest with you, Adam, the game runs like absolute shit.
That's good.
So I hate being that guy, but I want to have full disclosure with the information I have.
No, it makes sense.
I'm hoping that, because this is going to be a release that's for the Dreamcast as well as the Saturn. And it's, if I'm remembering correctly, it's basically a reskin of a Neo Geo game, I believe. I might be wrong in that. Don't take me 100% on that. But it's a 2D fighter. It's got some awesome sprite work. But I really feel like this is going to be a Dreamcast game that he's trying to make into a Saturn game. And I really hope that it comes about. But with what I've seen so far, it's entirely unplayable.
No, that's unfortunate.
So maybe it was a bad build that I got, but I've had two builds of it already, and it's the same issues. So I'm hoping that the people who are playing the game, that are actually testers for the game, are actually communicating back to him. And let me put it this way: I'm not trying to be the negative guy. I'm not trying to be like, hey, don't go buy that game. What I'm saying is, Josh Prod, if you actually hear this, please take my thoughts into account, and I really hope you can make this game work, because I want anything for the Sega Saturn to be a success, including your project.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because, again, if it is successful, then it could lead to more Sega Saturn games coming out. You never know. Josh Prod does a lot of insane releases for various platforms, so if you can open that door and get a bunch of his stuff onto the Saturn, that would be great.
Exactly.
So anything else you want to say on this? Oh, I guess there's one other thing we can say. I think it's really neat that Sega got together with Retrobit and allowed them to release new Saturn controllers. That was just cool.
That was absolutely amazing because, man, I'm gonna tell you right now, that Model 2 gamepad that everybody loves so much was going for like $30 to $40 almost at one point. And even though the Retrobit controllers have had a number of issues with quality concerns over the shoulder buttons and the D-pad, they're like $25, $20. That's a hell of a lot better than having to go out up in the wild and try to find a good controller, or having mixed matched colors if you've got a US Saturn and like Japanese controllers.
So just wanted to throw that out there. They are going to do new Dreamcast controllers as well, but those are a while away. I actually saw the prototype of that at E3, and it's really weird because it has 2 extra buttons on it. And I asked them straight up, like, do you have a plan for that? Because what I thought was, there actually was a Dreamcast controller, like a third-party one that had 2 extra face button controllers, but all you could do with it was program it to do combinations. So, like, say, if you're playing Mortal Kombat Gold, you could pre-program, like, a fatality into that one button. So when it's time to do the fatality, you just press the button and the fatality happens. So I asked them, is it going to be something like that? And they're like, we don't know yet. We don't have a plan. We just put them there. And I was like, well, at least they're honest about it.
It would be awesome if they could create a Dreamcast controller that had the D-pad of the Sega Saturn and had 6 face buttons, and in a way was really like a Saturn 3D controller 2.5, to where you could actually have a awesome fighting controller for the Dreamcast without having to use like an ASCII pad or...
Yeah, I was going to say, you know about that one, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's also, not that this barely counts, but there are those Dreamcast controllers, the Saturn ones that actually that work on the Dreamcast. You ever seen one of those?
Right. Yep.
Yeah. There's that, but yeah, you're totally right. But I don't know, is there enough demand for that? I do think it is better. Actually, no, I take it back. There definitely is demand for that, because there's a hell of a lot of fighting games on the Saturn or Dreamcast, and if the Josh Prod stuff continues, then I guess there'll be more, along with more of these Neo Geo games we're getting. Anyway, go on.
I mean, the thing with it is, though, is that the Saturn controller is just, hands down, it's pretty much universally understood that the Saturn controller is one of the best 2D fighting controllers there is, period. Like, it's just amazing what you can do with that console, or at least with that controller. I mean, there was even a PlayStation 2 controller made by Sega that looks like a Saturn controller. I mean, come on.
I have it.
I wish I did, but it goes for a lot of money nowadays, and I've got a mortgage, so...
Yeah, that's fair. But yeah, no, I have that controller too. It's pretty neat. It's got like extra. It's got a PlayStation like start button on it and stuff. But it's cool. It's got a couple extra buttons. It's neat just to have it. But yeah, he's absolutely right. Like it is a cool controller to have research. So the fact that Retrobit and Sega did that is neat. I would hope that the fact that they opened that door would mean that they could maybe do some I don't want to call it cross contamination, but cross platforming, maybe to have like a Saturn controller that works on Dreamcast or something like that, so that you can have that same design but for the North American audience, more readily available for fighting games.
They just need to get with ASCII. And go ahead and recreate the ASCII controller. That's what they need to do, because that was an absolutely amazing controller.
That would be good too, but somehow I think Sega would be easier to work with, since they already are. But I agree with you. If they could do that, that would be ideal. Anything else you want to say on this subject?
No, I'm good, brother.
All right. So the next one is the last 2 subjects we've got here are both yours. So the next one is the impact of YouTube on gaming. So we kind of touched on this a little bit, and if I mean, you can explain your own premise, but if I think I understand it correctly, it's that gaming has changed fundamentally in the YouTube era, because a lot of people are making content about games, and that can have both positive and negative. It can show people content they never knew about, games they'd never heard of, and they can learn about, but also can have negative effects of things like screwing over prices and killing off games with a bad review and all that type of stuff. Is that basically what you're getting at?
Yeah, YouTube has, in a lot of ways, brought back the resurgence of retro gaming. And when I say retro gaming, I mean, of course, in the late 2000s and the early 2010s, we had, a cult. There was a lot of following for fourth generation and back. What I mean, really, by the whole aspect of this question is, The fifth generation, the sixth generation, those two generations of gaming were kind of like pushed over to the side. They weren't old enough to really be retro. They were so close that people were still playing them, but there wasn't really a lot of talk on YouTube. And in the past 4 or 5 years, I have seen a massive resurgence in love and appreciation for that era of gaming. And it's so awesome because that was the dawn of 3D. That's where our modern gaming really has its roots from. Even though 2D set the foundation, it was the fifth generation and the sixth generation that really created the style of gaming that we have today. At least in my opinion.
I agree completely.
And I can remember, like I talked about earlier, your channel. There was now he's known as Stop Skeletons from Fighting, but at the time he was something the polite. I don't know.
It was like the happy video game nerd.
Yeah, it was something, a play on the whole angry video game nerd thing that was going on back then, early YouTube. But him, there was, like I said, you, and then I believe there was GameSack and a couple of other channels that really got me back into retro gaming. There was a point in my life between 2008 and 2012 that I really wasn't big into gaming anymore. There was a whole bunch of life events that happened, and it wasn't there. But YouTube is what got me back into gaming. It really did. Back into gaming outside of current gen consoles. And besides that, there was about 2015 is whenever it really hit home, because I still had my Saturn. I still bought up a lot of collections. In fact, I have almost the entire North American library. Most of it's disc only though because of eBay lots. Screw you, eBay. But there was a YouTuber, and it's my buddy Mel, Sega Lord X. He started his channel in 2015, I believe, is when I first saw it. And he was a smaller creator, just like I am now. And he was almost exclusively about Sega, especially the Saturn. And that just like kicked it up a notch, because like we were talking about earlier with the, the kind of the resurgence of the community, there was the first time I'd seen a channel that was damn near dedicated to the Saturn, and I ate it up. I mean, it was like going back into, because I mean, he has this game segment formula of sorts to where it was like 7 or 8 games in a video, and it was just bringing back all these games that I hadn't played in years, games that I have, but I haven't played them because I wasn't thinking about them. And very much like you said, there's the negative aspects of it, because you have, I hate to be that guy, because I mean, I've watched his videos before and I used to enjoy a lot of his content, but the hidden gems and all the rest of this crap, it's like you've got people that, not necessarily by nature of them, I don't think there's any malice behind most of what these people do. It isn't like I feel like they're wanting to jack up prices, but whenever you have large creators who are talking about games and talking about rare games and putting things in that kind of peripheral, it just has this negative impact almost, to where you see games artificially inflated. And it doesn't even have to come from YouTube. I mean, it happens on eBay all the time. But there's kind of a yin and a yang to YouTube gaming. I've really seen it as an awesome experience for younger generations to actually enjoy and appreciate for the very first time some of these older consoles that we grew up with. And of course, there's also the issue with absolutely destroying the community and people's pocketbooks at the same time. So.
Yeah, I guess I basically have to agree. I mean, because the very short, easy way to look at that is, the game. If a game is unknown to the world, even if it's fantastic, and a YouTuber gives it a bunch of exposure, that's great, because now more people will know about it. But then supply and demand. Well, now people know about it, now they want it, and that creates more expensive prices. So it's as you said it best. It's a yin and a yang thing, because there will be that group of the community that already knows about the game, and they get upset that now they have to deal with a lot more competition. But at the same time, you have to look at the other way and be like, yeah, but you also have a lot more allies now. You have a lot more of your community. So I think we already kind of said it best. The effect on YouTube as far as gaming goes is that it's just a yin and a yang. That's, I think, absolutely the best way to put it.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword for certain. I do hope that how can I put this? I really do hope that we have the smaller creators on YouTube, in my opinion, do some of the best work, because they aren't pushed by the algorithm yet, it feels like, and they're just kind of doing stuff because they really want to.
Yeah.
And I see some of the I see some of the best content coming out of smaller creators, especially right now. I mean, not guys that are just sitting in front of a camera, but I mean, people that are actually taking the time, writing scripts, doing massive amounts of research. One of my good buddies, Genovi, he's got like 7,000 subscribers at this point, I believe, and he does some absolutely amazing deep dives and documentaries and, you know, thought-provoking videos on, a lot of it has to do with Sega. And it's awesome to see that, because it's, what I've noticed is that the bigger a lot of these channels get, the less, I guess the more saturated their videos kind of become. It just kind of, it's all about the algorithm. It's not necessarily about passion anymore. It kind of feels that way sometimes.
You mean like news for views, and their channels become very formulaic?
I swear to God, dude, this daily news cycle of gaming and what Nintendo Switch thing are we going to talk about today has honestly put me off of about half the people I was subscribed to. I mean, seriously,
I apologize for the subject before then.
Dude, I mean, I'm going to be completely honest, and I know a lot of people in the community who are the same way. If a channel goes from, look, man, if your thumbnail is you trying to, you know, deep throat a cucumber while you're looking at something, it's negative. I'm unsubscribing. It's done.
Ah, I know who you're talking about.
I'm just saying, bro.
Well, yeah, no, I've personally have tried not to go down that route. I've been doing this for 10 years, but the one thing I've just like never wanted to do is news for views. I'm tired. I've said this many times. I'm tired of seeing like the same. I'm subscribed to a whole bunch of people, and then like some news subject breaks, and I'm like, oh, I know which 8 of them are going to cover the exact same subject, and then they do. And I'm like, if I have thoughts on it, like the Nintendo Switch Lite, for example, I'll throw it into the podcast. I'll put it in there for a few minutes, give it, and just be done with it. Like, in case for those who want my opinion, but I don't go out of my way to try and make a video entirely about that, unless it's something I'm super passionate about for one reason or another. In a lot of cases, it's like Shenmue. And the only other thing that I've ever kind of done like that is a subject that seems like nobody covers, which was when Microsoft was still doing OG Xbox backwards compatibility updates for the Xbox One. I did a video on every single update, and if you look at it, like almost nobody did videos on that for some reason. And I don't know why.
The deal, though. I mean, that's the deal, though. You said it. I mean, you said the word. It's passion. You know, there was a point in YouTube where it was, and I call my channel this. It's a passion project. It's stuff I love. It's stuff I want to talk about. It's stuff I want to share. I mean, YouTube was broadcast yourself, and in the past couple of years, especially since around 2014, that entire idea has greatly shifted. I mean, there's been more of a. You're a much larger creator than me, so your experience plus your time on the platform, your experience is vastly different from mine. But from my perspective, there are the people who are still dedicated, even if they do daily or weekly or double weekly, you know, uploads. You can still see the passion in what they're doing, versus the people who are just doing something to get views and therefore, you know, monetization. You know, I mean, that's kind of what it feels like. You have that schism between the people who are still passionate and the people this has just turned into a job.
Yeah, I'd say that's fair. Anything else on that subject? I mean, I don't disagree with you.
Oh man, I mean, it's just like we could talk this subject to death, and I've done it many times before. It's just like I don't know. I kind of wish YouTube would go back to. I wish the community would go back to just talking about the things they love rather than trying to make income from it. Because I mean, it's kind of like, excuse me, my sinuses are all acting up today.
You're good.
But there was a point in time where it seemed like people were here on the platform to actually let you into a part of their lives. And there was, of course, the people who had the personas, you know, the Angry Video Game for prime example, just that persona of his. But I really loved it whenever you got to see people who they really were. Because it's by nature of the internet itself. I mean, you and me both grew up in an era where the internet was this like magical thing, dude, and it's like AOL, and it's just people that were born into this technology that we have today, even in its infancy, that they don't understand it. Like, I still know how to use the Dewey Decimal System. Okay, I can go find a book without a computer. So it's just kind of wild to see the differings in how the community is today versus how it was even 10 years ago. And I really do wish that the whole aspect of YouTube would go back to that personal touch to it. I know it won't happen because just by nature of how YouTube is now, it's a money making enterprise for a lot of people.
I agree. I think what killed it was actually the monetization. It wasn't until, because monetization didn't really occur kind of widely until 2012. I mean, certain people could get in before that, but after that, it was kind of inevitable that it was going to get corrupted by those that saw it only as a job. Now, I don't know how much you know about me in particular. Like, I am a YouTuber. That is my job. But I also, right. Like I said, I don't like to make videos just for the purposes of it trying to get views and just to make the most out of it. Like, if I wanted to go down that route and just make videos all day about Nintendo did what? And like throw some weird thumbnail of my face like all shocked and shit about the Switch Mini and how it looks like shit, or Switch Lite, whatever. And I'd be like, I could do that. But I would not be happy with myself for doing that. So that's why I try to keep it to just making content I actually would be interested in watching. And I think that's the way to go. But then again, my growth is not as successful as those. But I have been doing it for 10 years and I'm still here. So there's that.
Well, the thing that's awesome about your channel, man, is that, like, I mean, I normally see an upload from you like once a week or twice a week most of the time. I mean, that's just what my notifications get.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I realize that, I mean, I don't know what all you do for work. I know you were working with Machinima for a long time. I heard you talk about that. And, I mean, you're always on the go to places. Like, it's not like you're sitting here every single day trying to make a YouTube video. And I have nothing against people who do daily uploads. In fact, I watch a couple of people that do that. Most of them are kind of like, filmmaking and vlogging and stuff like that. But it's kind of a breath of fresh air to see channels like yours that are still kind of, you can still see the passion in it. It's not just the money making greed. It's not just this is my job, I have to make a video. I mean, that might very well be the case for you, like you said, but you don't come across that way most of the time. The one thing I will say though is, I kind of get put off all the time whenever you do the playload videos. Like, I'll watch like half the playload video just to see what kind of older stuff you get. And then it's like, oh, dude, now we got to talk about all the Switch shit.
Yeah, well, that's how it works.
It's all good, man. You're never going to have your entire audience happy all the time.
Oh, it's impossible. It's totally impossible.
I do really appreciate it, though, whenever you do your anything related to Shenmue, as well as the I used to really enjoy your what are they called? I can't remember what they were called. The damn restoration videos. They were almost ASMR, dude. They were almost like ASMR, dude.
Oh, dude, I just put one out the other day. Cleaning Super Famicom Jr. It came out like 2 days ago.
Damn it, boy. I didn't see that.
It'll be there for you. You go ahead. You can check it out after we're done recording. So are you good on this subject? You want to move on?
I'm totally good, bro. We go with it.
All right. So we are on our last subject, and this was again yours. So I will pose the question, and you can elaborate. The question is, where do we see gaming going?
All right. This is one of those that I've talked about to a number of people, and I've always kind of gotten different responses. For me, gaming today is still about console play. Modern gaming I'm talking about. Of course, I'm a PC gamer as well. I do most of my first-person shooters on PC. And not to mention, there's just the availability of PC gaming. It's so much easier to get a hold of a game, to modify games. You don't have to pay for online access. But a lot of people are still kind of afraid of PC gaming, it seems like, and then you have to throw in the whole aspect of retro gaming. I know a lot of people, including myself, who have just completely retro gamed for months on end, not even touching newer games. Like, I've still got, cellophane on about 12 PS4 games. It's just, it's stupid. But for me, at least, I feel that gaming is going to I feel like the PC side of gaming and the console side of gaming are going to come together. I feel that's inevitable at this point. I mean, effectively, your PS4s, your PS5s, your Xbox Ones, and all this, they are basically just PCs. But what we were talking about earlier with the Switch, I feel like the Switch is kind of opening up this different avenue of gaming where I kind of look at the Nintendo Switch as a big ass smartphone, dude. That's how I look at it. Like, seriously, it's lower res, it's not as fast, it's not as capable, but it's got lots of games on it that a lot of people like to play on the go. And I kind of feel like that's where gaming is going. You are going to have a market that is completely about on the go mobile, which is going to get closer and closer to what we have for modern generation gaming. And then you're going to have what the Sony and the Xbox brand is going to push to, which is going to be closer, if not eventually just turn into a PC. And I feel that's what's going to happen. And I kind of look at it in the next 10 years, we're probably going to get to that point. I know people were saying that 10 years ago, but I feel like you're going to have a divergence in gaming where it's strictly mobile gaming and strictly PC gaming. And I kind of feel like that's honestly going to be a bad thing. Not because of lack of, there's going to be an awesome amount of variety of games, but I kind of feel like having those two separate worlds is going to create two entirely different type of gamers that don't ever really get to coalesce with each other, which I feel like we still have to a degree right now, is that there's still a measure of coalescing between the different communities. I kind of feel like the further those two things get away from each other, which I kind of feel that's how it's going, that you're going to have this complete separation. We make fun of people now that are smartphone gamers. It's like, oh, they're a gamer, but they only play on their smartphone. Well, in 10 years, that's going to be a legitimate form of gamer because those games are going to be what you're playing right now on a PlayStation 4.
Yeah. I agree that we're going into an all-digital future. I think that as much as I am very pro physical media. Anybody who watches me or knows anything about me knows that I'm very much a retro content gamer, and I like modern stuff, but I do need my physical edition. But that doesn't make me delusional. I know that the all digital is coming. Things like Stadia and all that sort of stuff. That's inevitable. Now, I inaccurately predicted that I thought that this current generation that we're in would be the last one of traditional game consoles. Now, fortunately, that's not going to be the case. We are going to have, we believe, Scarlet and PS5 will both be physical media based, but at the same time, they might as well not be. I mean, unless they're coming out with a new type of disc that supports a higher storage medium. There was some talk that Sony had come up with some sort of 300 gigabyte disc, but unless they have that, I mean, we live in a generation now where discs don't even hold enough capacity for some of the patches for games like Halo Master Chief Collection. You put that on a Blu-ray disc, right? And it's like a 40 gigabyte disc, but it'll have like, I'm not even joking, there's like 100 gigabytes worth of patches. And it's like, you can't have that game physically, not truly. So, and that's this generation. So next generation around, if you're still using traditional Blu-ray technology that's been around since 2005, 2006, you can't ever really truly have the physical version. You can have the first chunk of it, the beginning of the installer, and that's about it. So unless they've upgraded that, we won't ever really have traditional physical media consoles again. And as that goes on, it's going to be more and more digitally accepted that we're going to have digital distribution. I've been saying for years, and they've only made it more obvious, that Microsoft wants out of hardware at some point in favor of Xbox as a brand, a digital distribution service. And essentially that's what Xbox Game Pass has become, putting it onto the PC ecosystem. And I'm sure if they could, they would put it onto the Switch and PS4 and call it a day. But I think to basically currently appease the fan base in the current gaming market, they have to stay in hardware, at least for the foreseeable future. But I do think there's going to come a time where they bow out in favor of that because they're trying to move everything to an all-digital structure. Sony is, I think they wish they could. I think the fact that they're Japanese makes that more difficult because the Japanese like to have everything physical, so that kind of makes it difficult for them. And then Nintendo will always be Nintendo. They're going to go do whatever the hell they want to do, and they somehow are immune to logic. So good for them, like we talked about earlier. But they can just keep doing that. But I agree with you. The time is coming where we just kind of have this all digital structure where things that looked kind of silly to us earlier will be the more serious stuff. And personally, I find that to be sad and depressing, but at the same time, I do have to accept my age and I have to accept where I'll be when all of this occurs. And there's, let's assume by the time this happens, I mean, I'm 32 now. By the time this happens, I might be 40 and I may not give a shit anymore. You know what I mean? Like, it's like I'll care about gaming, but it's like I might be at a completely different place in my life where I don't necessarily care as much about who's got all digital and who's got physical. I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, in 8 years, a lot happens, and sometimes you just drop out of the gaming industry or gaming culture. I'm not saying I'm going to do that, but all I'm saying is you don't really know how stuff's going to play out, and you don't know if you're going to care when it gets there. But I would hope for anyone else who is, super into games, that they are just, like we said at the very beginning of this, as long as you are not hurting anyone and you're happy with the gaming experiences you're having with however they're formed, whether it's the actual games, the collecting of games, the talking about games, the researching of games, whatever it is, that thing, whatever that quote unquote game is to you, as long as it's making you happy, then I say just keep going.
Yeah, and entirely, dude, entirely. I think the only thing I can really add to that is I kind of am not looking forward to the day that it's entirely digital. I mean, we're already there, like you said, with the install rates. I mean, basically, we don't have games won't fit on the media anymore, which I kind of wonder how people who don't have internet access even play some of the games we have nowadays.
Dude, I've seen many YouTube comments. You would be stunned by this, I'm sure, but I have seen YouTube comments from people who occasionally leave stuff like, they're like, "Hey, I don't connect my PS4 or my Xbox One ever to the internet. I just play the game, so it's fine." And then, but basically what the short version of that is, there are people who play the broken builds of the games off disc, where they never get the patches, they never get any of the updates, and then that's it. That's their experience. And I find that insane.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. It's just the whole aspect of day one patches has completely blown my mind. Still to this day it does. But I know people who do not have access to the internet or refuse to have access to the internet for whatever reason. And I've been over there and played games at their house, and some of these games are just like, you can tell what that day one patch was doing.
Yeah. Because it's built into the development cycle now. They factor it in as part of development. It's like it has a release date, and you just print the version you've got to that disk with the full expectation we're continuing development, and it'll just download the updates to fix itself later. But there is, believe it or not, everybody out there listening, there is a good chunk of people who just play whatever the build is on the disk, which is a really bad idea. And it's sad, unfortunately. I mean, it's sad for them that they're getting an inferior version, but it's sad for the state of gaming that we have to live in that ecosystem where your physical media version of the game is not at all preserved. It's missing tons of content, but it is what it is.
And to kind of go back in time a little bit, a lot of people consider this day one patch thing an issue of modern day gaming, which, I mean, the day one patch is, but just remember back whenever we were kids, there was, the game you got on a disc wasn't always completely 100% correct. There's a prime example being on the Sega Saturn is Albert Odyssey. A lot of people don't realize that there was a second printing of that game. The disc art and everything's different. The first printing of the game has a number of bugs that are game breaking, that if you get that bug and you have a save file with that bug, you are pretty much stuck. You are never going to beat the game. And it literally took them a second printing to fix it. And the only people who really know about it now are people from 10, 15 years later who realize that, well, if you get a save file that has this bug in it, you are never going to get through the last level. You are literally going to get locked out of the game, or it's going to freeze on you, or it's going to corrupt all your data. There's like 4 or 5 things that can happen. And I actually had a subscriber of mine ask me about it a couple of weeks ago in a video. They said, "Man, I didn't know that." And lo and behold, not 2 weeks later after they made that comment, they hit a bug in a legit copy of the game. Like, that's what I mean. There are so many issues from older games as well that we kind of take for granted that we have these day one patches now, and we kind of hate them. Mm-hmm. But back in the day, it was the game you had was the game you had, and Correct. If there was something wrong, it was wrong.
So let's elaborate on that for a second. I don't want to say that we're like old fogies who are looking back with rose-colored glasses and saying the past was always perfect, because it wasn't. But the basic point we're making is, in the past, games, as you say, can't be updated. So the game had to be done. If it wasn't done, it was a more serious problem like that. The disc itself was junk, basically. So for the most part, they had to strive for that complete success. And obviously there would be mistakes that would occur along the way. The patch concept as an idea is not bad. It can fix those things. The problem is, it's now become part of the development cycle. Rather than being an emergency backup procedure, it's now just become standard to always do that, which to me is the flaw. Because if games were built with the expectation of they need to be done on release date, we have this emergency patch system in case we screw something up, that would be okay. But that's not how history played out.
Well, really, this whole situation with day one patches really started like midway through the 7th gen. I mean, if you remember, I mean, there was patches even during the PS2 era. I mean, there was patches that came up on that came on some of the official PSN magazines that you could load onto a memory card.
You could do that with OG Xbox too. Yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, that was one of the very earliest ways that they figured out how to bypass the piracy on the PS2, for instance. But it was only during about, I think it was like 2010. About that was about whenever I remember really day one patches really starting to be a thing.
Yeah.
Like up until then, I mean, even with my PS3 and Xbox 360, yeah, you'd have patches, but most of the time those patches were to add new content or to fix small little bugs, and like the patch would be like 4 or 5 megabytes.
Yeah.
That was it. You know,
I remember that too.
And I can remember it was I want to say it was Battlefield 3 was the first game I really remember having a massive patch whenever I got it. And I played it on, it was the only Battlefield at the time that I'd ever played on console. And I can remember the day I bought it, day one, and whenever I went to put the game in, there was like a 40, like a, not a 40, it was like a 20 gigabyte patch for the game.
On Xbox 360?
No, on PS3.
Oh. That's a lot.
I might have been 20 megabytes, it might have been 200 megabytes, but I just remember there was a huge update the very first day. It might be my memory just getting fuzzy, but I remember that game having a huge update before I could even play it.
Yeah.
Of course, back then my internet was shit, so.
Yeah. But it's sad that that's how gaming has gone, but that only adds credibility to the fact that, again, we're going to an all-digital section of gaming, and we're in a weird transition phase, I think, between the physical media that's essentially always complete, and then the all-digital era where the physical media aspect of it doesn't matter. We're in the phase of, and I think this will be looked back on as that strange era where we had physical editions of broken games for some reason.
Well, let me pose this question to you real quick.
Sure.
The PC that you're working on right now, is it a desktop or a laptop?
It is a desktop.
Does that desktop have a DVD drive?
It does. It has a Blu-ray drive, actually.
So whenever you bought that machine, did you actually plan or build it, whatever the case was? Did you buy or build?
It was built.
Okay, so you built it with the intention of having a way to read optical media.
Correct. But that's me.
Exactly. That's pretty much why I have optical media on my PC, is because I built it to have optical media.
Yeah.
Go out there and try to find me a PC that's pre-built that has optical media.
Oh, you can't. And it creates a very unique situation. Like, I know I talk way too much about Shenmue, but one thing I want to talk about in this, because people brought it up, is the Kickstarter edition of the game, the physical PC edition. Everyone's upset because it doesn't include, or didn't include, a physical disc with the game on it. It now includes a physical disc that just has the Epic launcher on it. But a bunch of people were saying, like, I wanted it to have the game. And I'm thinking, like, I don't game on PC, so I don't have as much of a dog in that fight. But the way it was explained to me is, how would that work? Most modern PCs do not bother having optical drives, and if they do, it's usually leftover DVD drives. It's not Blu-ray drives. So if you put the game on a Blu-ray, most people who have a PC wouldn't be able to use it. And if you had to put it on DVD, it would be like 10 discs of just install files. Does it have a point?
That's the deal. I mean, like, I've been PC gaming for a while, and I remember whenever you did that video, and I made a comment on there talking about I'm not that big a PC gamer. I'm not big up into the culture as much as some people are, but there's the culture of, well, Steam is this and Epic is this, and it's they're all launchers. I've got like 5 of them already, and I have to go through what I go through, and there's that whole discussion. But besides all that, what I'm saying is that 7 years ago I started seeing any form of optical media go away. In fact, I have a laptop from like 2013 that does not have optical drive. So I saw it coming a long time ago, and it really pissed me off to begin with. But to be honest with you, I've kind of accepted it at this point. The reason I have optical media now is so I can play older games, so I can actually burn games, so I can try things out, stuff like that. It has a purpose besides PC gaming. You know, I have an entire rig for older PC gaming, like, you know, my Windows XP 98 build, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think PC gamers are already at that point where we understand that digital is the way forward. That it's the only applicable way forward at this point, because the size of the games is too large. The amount of content is too large. The expandability of games, that is something that we take for granted now. But I mean, like you and me were talking about, showing our age, there was no expandability of games. There really wasn't whenever we were growing up. I mean, yeah, you had things like on the N64, you had the expansion pack. The Dreamcast actually had true expansion material, DLC of sorts. I remember whenever it was it was an expansion pack. It wasn't DLC. Like, I still don't understand when that changed. But we just take it for granted today that games can be different a year down the road than what they are today. And it's something that I'm still getting used to. There's so many games that I can play now that if I set them down for 2 years and come back to them, it's an entirely different game.
Yeah. That's just because they're constantly making new modes, and games are not like what they were for us, where they were just a done thing that you remember fondly as a piece of history. To compare it to, say, something like a movie, it would be... I think the closest thing to compare it to would be like maybe the original Star Wars trilogy. It was a thing. It was done. People liked it. And then George Lucas kept making changes to it. And then had he continued to do that, who knows? We would have ended up with a movie that was no longer Star Wars, like, at all. That's kind of what's happening
in episode 4.
Yeah, there you go. Like, we've digitally inserted all of the Gungans into episode 4, and like, or something. Like, it's just a totally different movie. We redubbed everything. It's now exclusively in Spanish, or whatever. Like, it's a completely different movie. It's not even the same thing. That's essentially what can happen with video games now. Now, a lot of those are persistent world, like, open world type of games that we don't really like, that require persistent updates and things like that. But that's not like the type of games. 5. Say what?
Like GTA 5, for instance.
Yeah, GTA 5 is constantly changing, but again, that's the online ecosystem. The right. Local ecosystem just has like new content, but it's still essentially the same single player campaign, as I recall. But
right.
Yeah, but your point is completely valid. Like, games are still in development basically after release. Some it's just a simple patch, and some it's just literally like Fortnite, like it's just constantly growing, evolving, and changing and becoming something completely different.
Yeah, entirely. And in some respects, I honestly really do enjoy it. For instance, like PUBG, I play PUBG immensely. I'm not a Fortnite guy. Mm-hmm. And it's cool to see how games can be changed and altered in different environments, and you get a lot more replay value that way.
Of course, because there's new content constantly.
Exactly. But at the same time, it's just kind of depressing to know that, I don't know, it's just nostalgia, or it's just that mentality that we were talking about from the 90s. I want that game to be that game. I
agree.
It to be, it's that, and I can come back to it 5 years from now and it still be that. There's just that part of me that still wants that, and we just don't really get it.
I know. I agree completely. And like I said, if to put that in perspective, it would just be like, think of it as movies. Yep. If they were, we all hate when they do like reboots and remakes of movies that we used to love. In a weird way, some video games have become that. It's just that they evolve into the reboot or the remake over time. Right. Do you know what I'm saying?
Oh yeah, no, I agree. I was just furthering. That's all.
Yeah, so, it would be like if Ghostbusters, 1984, evolved slowly into Ghostbusters 2016. You'd be like, how the hell did you get from here to here? Rather than be like, I just want to go back and watch Ghostbusters and not watch this remake. Certain video games evolve and change, and that can be for the good or that can be for bad, but you're absolutely right. No one can ever really go back to Fortnite and say, I want to play Fortnite the way it was when it came out. It's like, can you even do that? Is that even possible?
I do.
You do?
That, like, before the building aspect of Fortnite, it was awesome. Whenever people started figuring out how to do all this building crap, people are going to be like, man, the SSG we used to play Fortnite. No, I can't watch this guy anymore. No, I mean, Fortnite used to be good back whenever it was basic first-person shooter, and then it just turned into what it is today.
So you're seeing my point, and I'm not trying to sit here and rail on Fortnite. I'm just using it as an example because it's such an obvious one. That's an entire discussion that can be had. Is just what is that, in gaming? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Or is it just a thing? The evolution in real time of video games.
It is a thing, and I honestly feel like it can destroy a game, and it can take a game that was dying and bring it back to life, and that is the good aspect of it.
Yeah. So again, yin and yang. That's the theme of this whole podcast.
Yin and yang, man. You got to get balance in your life. Do like that old girl, and get rid of the things that don't bring joy.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, anything else to say on this?
No, I have thoroughly enjoyed our little talk we've had there, Adam.
Yeah, thank you, Samuel, for being here.
Oh, yeah, I appreciate the opportunity. I'd asked if you minded if I shouted out a few people, and I believe you agreed.
Go for it, my friend.
Okay, again, I would like to shout out Mr. David Lee. He does some amazing reproductions. You can find him on Facebook under Saturn Dave. Genovi. He is an absolutely amazing smaller YouTuber. Go give him some love if you are into Sega in any way, especially deep dives and stuff like that. Also, my buddy Mel, Sega Lord X, he's getting up there in subscribers, but he's still a smaller creator, and he does some awesome work, especially if you kind of like personal stories, the game sack kind of formula. He does awesome work with that. And yeah, I think that's about it right now. Of course, you can come watch my stuff too. I mean, you like it, you don't like it, that's cool too. But, as long as you're playing some Sega Saturn, I really don't care, bro.
Well, where can they find you?
Oh, you can find me on YouTube under the Southern Sega Gentleman. I am the only Southern Sega Gentleman, so it's not hard to find me. Of course, you can find me on Facebook, the Southern Sega Gentleman as well there. I am on Twitter, SMilesDrew. That's my tag, but just type Southern Sega Gentleman, you'll find me. And yeah, I'm pretty much universal across everything. Hell, I'm even on Instagram, man.
There you go. Perfect. I also want to give some shout outs again to our Patreon backers: Corey Marsh, Jesse Perez, Joseph Tamburino, Luis Bonilla, Michael Kelly, Eric Perez, Trey Wagner, Tim Inman, and a special one to Wubio, who again brought you, Samuel, here onto the show. So that, again, thank you to him for that. And of course, Samuel, thank you very much for being on the show. I appreciate it.
Oh yeah, no problem. Really appreciate it, Wubio. You good people, man.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for listening, and we'll see you all later.